Hey everybody, this is Billy with Wolf River Music. We're back again, and this is episode number 2 of the Vinyl Review. And just like we promised last time, here's the album, The Rolling Stones Now, released in the United States on February 13th, 1965. And I make the distinction of this album being released in the United States because it is not the same version or the exact same album that was released in the UK, which was titled simply Rolling Stones Number 2, which came out just a month before this one and had a very different lineup of songs than its American counterpart. And just so you know, this same scenario is going to come up several times very early on in our total album countdown. It was the norm back in those days for British bands and artists to have 2 different record labels, one that operated in the UK and then one that operated in the US. And the album releases were always very different, with the one coming later attempting to capitalize on what was perceived to be the hit songs versus the ones that weren't. So in other words, the second release always tried to include the more popular songs in lieu of the ones that were less popular, as a way of basically attempting to make the album sell better. Now, a lot of times this was basically based on pure speculation, and a lot of times it was also just very wrong. Just because a song was a big hit in the UK did not always necessarily mean that it was also going to be a big hit in the United States, and vice versa. One other piece of information about this particular set of songs on this album is that out of the total of 12 songs included here, 11 of them were actually recorded in the United States, and only one of these songs was recorded in London. Now, you might not think that this means a whole lot right now, but this fact is going to come up again later in this review when we start talking about sound quality and overall album continuity. It was a small factor in the end rating of this album. And so before we just dive right into this, let's go ahead and address the biggest elephant that's always been in the room whenever a discussion of the early Stones comes up, and that was the ever-looming presence of their biggest musical rivals, which was, of course, the Beatles. Now, people who are die-hard fans of the Rolling Stones become very annoyed when this conversation comes up, because obviously these two groups, other than both of them being the biggest bands on the planet at that time, and both being British, are really almost nothing alike. The Rolling Stones didn't want to be like the Beatles, or really even to be compared in any way to the Beatles. They considered them to be the good guys of that time period, and the Stones didn't mind being considered the bad guys. They wanted to foster a much different kind of a reputation that was considered to be more risque and dangerous. In the very earliest days of the band, with a manager who was only 19 years old at the time, younger even than they were, and not even old enough yet under British law to even legally sign a contract, they initially tried to copy the ideas of Beatles manager Brian Epstein, and just like the band he was managing at the time, to have the Rolling Stones all dress in matching suits. Well, this only lasted a very short time, and under the direction of the very young Andrew Loog Oldham, they all decided that they wanted their new band to wear unmatched clothing, to have much longer hair than anyone else at the time, and to exude an aura of being threatening, raunchy, even animalistic. They were more attracted to the topics of sexual innuendo, and as time went on, they even began using downright blatant references to illicit drug use and hedonism. Now, the Beatles did that too, but they were a little more coy in their presentation, and not so downright blunt about it. It's almost impossible not to resort to at least some kind of contrast and comparison between the career achievements of these two groups, who were essentially the biggest 1-2 punch of the mid to the late 1960s. And yes, that will happen here. But before we do any of that, let's go ahead and get some real facts down on the table about the actual relationships that the members of these two groups had with each other in reality. Even back in the 1960s, before the internet basically ruined all of our lives, the media were using controversy and downright deception in order to stir up resentment, even anger, between the rival fan bases of these two groups. Why? Because first of all, just like now, it kept people reading and talking about the articles they saw in newspapers and magazines. And the respective music labels of the groups enjoyed this too, because they believed that it kept the competing images of these two bands front and center. And thus, they also believed that it increased record sales and interest in concert tickets. So you see, we were being played before most of us listening here today were even born. And we probably still are. 90% of all that alleged feuding, bad blood, catty insults, etc. between the Beatles and the Stones were completely made up, and most of it was just not true. So, here's some truth about it now. The members of the Beatles and the Rolling Stones were actually quite friendly with one another and would often hang out together during those brief moments when their paths would cross, either while they were out on tour or in recording sessions. In fact, Paul McCartney and John Lennon wrote the song I Want to Be Your Man and then basically just gave it to the Stones, who recorded it in 1963, and it became one of their very earliest hits. Paul said that the song reminded him of the Bo Diddley sound, and he knew that the Stones were into that. So he felt like it just suited them better. Brian Jones actually played the saxophone on a Beatles song in 1967 called You Know My Name, Look Up the Number, which didn't even see the light of day until 2 years later when it was placed on the B-side of the Let It Be 45 RPM single. Mick Jagger inducted the Beatles into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1988. And even to this very day, Paul McCartney still sends Keith Richards a case of beer every single year for Christmas. Now, with all that being said, there have been a few moments in time where there may have been some comments made, either in anger or in jest, or that may have been misquoted by the press, that seem to show that the relationships between certain members of these two groups weren't always peachy. John Lennon said in a Rolling Stone magazine interview in 1970 that he believed the Stones were copying the Beatles and imitating them always a few months after every single time the Beatles released a new album. He called Mick Jagger a joke, insulted Jagger's ability to dance by dropping a homophobic slur about him in this same interview, and then accused Jagger of saying, quote, hurtful and tardy things about the Beatles, unquote. Sounds to me like John was just in a bad mood that day, but who knows? And as for that song that John and Paul wrote for them in 1963, well, again, according to Lennon, he stated that he considered this song to be a throwaway and that they would have never given them anything that he and Paul considered to be great material, and that it also showed that no one else in the Beatles ever really considered the Stones to be all that important back then. He claims they wrote the song in about 10 minutes and then gifted it to them just to be nice. Again, is this John just being a bit grumpy about all of it? Maybe. Even so, both Mick Jagger and Keith Richards have stated that they were in awe of the fact that John and Paul could just simply walk off into the corner of a crowded and noisy room and write what turned out to be a hit song in about 10 minutes. They also said that this event was a turning point for both of them because it inspired Jagger and Richards to become better songwriters themselves, and they wanted to be like Lennon and McCartney in that respect. Now, the last thing that I will bring up was something that was said in more modern times, 2020 to be exact. And it seems like this one was a real doozy. Paul McCartney said on the Howard Stern show that, quote, "The Stones are rooted in the blues. We, the Beatles, had a lot more musical influences than they did, and while I love the Stones, the Beatles were just better," end quote. Now, when Mick Jagger got wind of these comments, he just kind of laughed it off and said, quote, "Paul's just a sweetheart, and there is no competition between us. The Rolling Stones are a big concert band, and the Beatles never even did a big arena tour or played at Madison Square Garden with a decent sound system. They broke up before the business of real touring had even started. We started doing stadium gigs in the 70s, and we're still doing them now. And that's really the big difference between these two bands. One band is unbelievably lucky to still be playing in stadiums, and then the other band just doesn't even exist," end quote. Now, if I were you, I probably would take all of that with a big grain of salt. We are dealing with rock star egos after all. And over the course of a 60-year time period, these kind of quotes really only come up about once every decade. And we just don't know if they're being super serious about all of this or if they're just needling each other in jest. Okay, so let's get to this album that I'm holding now and talk more specifically about it and what's on it. Let's say that first and foremost, yes, the Rolling Stones in these early years were definitely rooted 100% in the blues. More specifically, American rhythm and blues of the mid-1950s to the very early 1960s. And even some of this material on the album dating back into the 1940s. There are 12 songs on this album, but only 4 of them are originals, written by Jagger and Richards. Much like their musical contemporaries, the Beatles, who were working non-stop and trying to squeeze in recording sessions in between touring and television and radio appearances, so too were the Rolling Stones. Now, one thing that I failed to mention back in episode 1 was about this notion that bands like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, who were viewed as very young groups who rose to immense fame very quickly, were somehow going to be suddenly forgotten if they weren't putting out new material at a clip of about 1 album every 5 months. This was mainly due to the fact that record labels back in those days just literally did not understand how to effectively manage the perceived shelf life of an incredibly popular new group. No one really knew back then that either of these bands were going to stand the test of time. And for all anybody really knew, they could have just been a passing fad that could have lasted a couple of years and then quickly went out of style, only to then be replaced by something else equally as flashy and temporary. No one knew that the Rolling Stones were still going to be recording and touring 60 years later. So by the end of the year, 1965, the Rolling Stones had essentially released, with the competing US releases at the same time, 3 full albums worth of music in the span of just a single year. But the Stones were a bit different than the Beatles, in that they were releasing mostly cover songs at this time, mainly because Jagger and Richards had just not gotten themselves to the point yet of being a prolific or a skilled songwriting duo like Lennon and McCartney. They also did a lot of cover songs because they were just simply better at doing that than they were at doing their own material. And this album, believe it or not, actually really does reflect that. And just as the Beatles had their big turning point in 1965 with the release of their album Rubber Soul, so too would the Rolling Stones have their big turning point. But that didn't occur until 1966 with the release of their album Aftermath. We're not there yet. We'll get to that one, but it's going to be just a bit of time before we actually come to it in our countdown. So I am now going to specifically point out 3 different songs on this album that we consider to be the high points. And the highest point of the three would be their cover of the Willie Dixon classic, Little Red Rooster. This is also essentially the most widely known song from this album, and it gained an even greater reputation as being one of the songs that was temporarily banned, for a short while anyway, on American radio stations because of the perceived overt sexual connotations that are allegedly found within the lyrics of the song. Excellent slide guitar work by Brian Jones on this one, and the laid-back, slower tempo really adds to the overall intensity and the mood of the song, giving it a slinky and an almost lazy kind of a groove. We like how the Stones felt like they didn't need to just hit you over the head with a juiced-up tempo, in the way that Sam Cooke had done it with the same song 2 years prior to this version. So moving on now to the second high point of the album, which would be the song Oh Baby, We Got a Good Thing Going, which was written by American blues guitarist and singer Barbara Lynn. Now this song isn't very long, but it has some pretty cool musical breaks in it and a few moments of stop time that allow Mick to show off some of his vocal chops. And of course the song is very typical of the Chuck Berry type early rock and roll standards with those hallmarks written all over it. But they did a good job with this one. Finally, the best overall musical performance by the band on this release is found on the song Down the Road a Piece, which was written by American songwriter Don Ray all the way back in 1940. Again, excellent guitar work by both Jones and Richards on this one. But the real standout on this song is the fabulous honky-tonk piano part that's played by Ian Stewart. So he really gets this one jumping. And even though this song is really nothing more than just a simple 1-4-5 chord progression and based on a 12-bar blues format, this song is really the right one to kick off side 2, which consequently is the stronger side overall. And the album as a whole is actually mostly consistent from start to finish. It seems to us, aside from the fact that this is mostly a collection of cover tunes, the Rolling Stones sound like they actually know how and what they want to sound like. But now, at this point in their very young careers, they just simply need to get better at all of it. And they need to ditch this older version of themselves, which was them playing cover songs at the Crawdaddy Club in Richmond. And they need to graduate up to the next level of originality. So this album does have its share of flaws and weaknesses on it. And so now we're going to get to that part of the review. Okay, low point number 1. The cover of the Bo Diddley song, Mona, I Need You Baby, is just of a lower sound quality when you compare it to the rest of the songs on this album. The mix on this song is just really not that good. Okay, so there's a couple of specific problems going on with this one. First of all, the vocals are just buried underneath the overly prominent tremolo guitars. The bass is almost completely imperceptible. In fact, so much so that it's hard to even pick the part out and figure out whether or not there's actually even one in there at all. So yeah, the mix on this one is just kind of murky and dark. And then I realized something. And that is that this song is the only one of the 12 songs on this album that was actually recorded at a studio in the UK. And please don't misunderstand me. There is nothing inherently wrong with any of the recording studios in the UK. And more specifically, at Regent Sound Studios in London. And just FYI, Regent Sound, in those days, was considered to be a very cheap alternative to many of the more expensive studios available in London. The very earliest Stones recordings were made there because it was inexpensive and booking times were readily available to up-and-coming bands. In fact, they were even encouraged by the owner to record there. They were kind of the studio that was using eggshell cartons on the ceilings and the walls as soundproofing. And it wasn't until about 1968 that they finally were bought out and underwent a massive upgrade in the building and in the recording equipment. So yeah, there's your reason for the lower quality mix right there. The studio actually does matter to a large degree. Okay, so moving on now to low point number 2 on this album. The song Off the Hook, which is a very early example of one of Mick and Keith's first attempts at songwriting. And let's just go ahead and be totally honest about this one. This is not a great song by any stretch of the imagination. Okay, so I know I've said this before, and I'm probably going to say it again many times, but I just want you to know that this assessment of this song, just like any assessment that we ever make, either in this review or any of the reviews to follow, has nothing to do with whether or not you or anyone else likes the song or the album in question. You have every right to like, love, hate any song or any album that we talk about here. And just because, in our opinion, something might be called low quality or less than great, whatever, it doesn't make any difference. And our opinions should have no effect at all on whether or not you like the song, you enjoy listening to it, or you don't. We're just trying to do a fair assessment of all of it. It's just that our opinion is that this song seems kind of juvenile, both lyrically and musically speaking. It's extremely basic and overly simplified, and it just kind of sounds like it was written by teenagers trying to write a song for other teenagers without any real depth or meaning to it. That's all. And we're not the only ones that feel that way. As a matter of fact, Mick and Keith included this one as an example of some of the early work that they wrote together that they now consider to be one of their, quote, kindergarten songs, unquote. Written very quickly and recorded very quickly without too much effort or time. And so, there you go. And that brings us now to our overall evaluation of this album as a whole. Other than possibly the one single song that seemed like it was recorded and or mixed poorly at the other studio in the UK, this album actually does have a very good and a consistent continuity to it. And that could be mainly due to the fact, like was already mentioned earlier, that the Rolling Stones sound like they know which direction that they want to go in. But now is the time for them to start heading that way with better songwriting skills and a greater purpose in mind, rather than just filling up an entire album where 2/3 of it is other people's material. There is nothing really earth-shattering on this album, musically or lyrically speaking. Most of the songs are made up of very simple 1-4-5 chord progressions and 12-bar blues arrangements. Not all of it, but a very good portion of it, yes. It's not terribly experimental or progressive, even for that time period. There is potential to be heard and found here, but the Stones have not yet turned the page. They're young, and they're still trying to figure out who they really are. Now, in terms of their group image, well then yeah, we could give them points for being mavericks in that sense, and for making it their purpose to want to be the opposite of the Beatles and, well, everyone else for that matter. But we're not reviewing their image here. We're reviewing the music that they recorded on this album. And because of that, one could make the argument that at this point, the Rolling Stones could be considered more style than overall substance. And since this is the stance that we're taking right now, we ended up giving this album an overall ranking of a 7.3, which on our grading scale is only a C. And even though I can already feel the hands of all the diehard Stones fans out there ready to come through the screen and choke me to death right now as we speak, but we are also choosing to not recommend this album for a vinyl collection. Unless you just happen to already be one of those Rolling Stones superfans and probably already own this album anyway, or maybe you were one of the ones that are ready to choke me to death right now. But the main reason that we are choosing to not recommend this album right now at this time is because we are just too close to the bigger and the better turning point that the Stones are about to make. And that one is coming up sooner than you might think. Remember, they had a very busy year, and it technically just started for them. They'll be back soon, bigger and so much better than they are here at the beginning of 1965. Thank you again for hanging out with us here, and please do come back again next time because we're headed back over the pond, back here to the home country, and we're going to focus our next episode on a little group from Hawthorne, California, who predate even the Stones and the Beatles. Please join us next time when we take a closer look at the Beach Boys and their 1965 album called The Beach Boys Today. Once again, this is Billy, and you've been watching the Vinyl Review. Take care, and please don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Good night, everybody.